Good afternoon, everyone. The governor just presented the executive budget. I think everyone should have it, and it's posted on the website right now. I am going to go through the financing plan and talk through how both the investments and how we finance it as a follow-up to the governor's presentation. It's helpful to start where we were a year ago, last January. Last January, the state was looking at a revenue shortfall of $39 billion over a four-year period. We had the blue line here is the pre-pandemic projection, and then the yellow line was the projection post-pandemic or in the middle of the pandemic. This was largely resulting from the economic impacts of the government, of the shutdowns, and also the surges that were actually happening in January of last year. So in January, what we faced was we had uncertainty. Federal funding was uncertain. When we put out the executive budget last year, vaccinations had started, but the question was, would they actually work? Would they be enough? Restrictions were in place both in New York State and across the country, and that obviously impacted economic activity, not just in New York, but all across the country. And then COVID cases, again, were surging nationally. Today, we find ourselves in a very different place, January of 22. COVID cases are surging, but as the governor's been talking about, we're starting to see meaningful declines. Pandemic restrictions also are significantly reduced from what they were, and their impact on economic activity is significantly decreased. On the funding side, billions of dollars in federal aid has materialized and has started to move. We now know that the vaccinations are abundant. People now have first, second, and third shots. And we know that the vaccinations are working to decrease the severity of COVID-19. So that's also helped the economy move forward and come back from where it was in January of last year. State revenues are also recovering far faster than anticipated. This is a national trend. But in New York, because of the impact of the financial sector, we're seeing it probably a little bit more profoundly. But we also saw a bigger decline than in other parts of the country. But we're in a strong financial position now as a result of the increase in strong tax receipts, a very strong stock market, and the federal aid from the pandemic, all of which were unanticipated in January of last year. There are still risks, but we start off in well-positioned from a budgetary perspective. The economic outlook, real U.S. GDP surpassed its pre-recession peak. So we were talking about whether or not there was a lot of talk whether there was going to be a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, and depending on, there's obviously an uneven recovery, which we'll talk about. But overall, GDP was very strong and grew past its pre-pandemic position after contracting 3.4% in 2020. The federal fiscal stimulus went out. It helped, but it's starting to diminish over the course of 2021. So this also helped GDP growth, both in New York and nationally. But again, that stimulus is declining, and we are seeing that also, that impact of that. It also impacted inflation, which we'll talk about. We have labor shortages, supply chain disruptions, energy prices that are growing. So these are all additional risks that are impacting our plan. And the fiscal stimulus has contributed to CPI growth of 4.7%. And this is the highest rate of inflation that we've seen in 30 years, since 1991. As of November, New York's economy has gained 62.6% of the private sector jobs lost in March and April of 2020. New York State's employment is projected to grow by 4.5% in 23, and private sector growth is expected to grow by 5%. State wage growth actually fell in 2021, right? But New York State wage growth is projected to increase by 11.4% in 2022, and that's mostly due to strong bonus payments and a rebound from the unemployment losses in the prior year. The fiscal stimulus, again, is starting to wane, right? And we expect that there will be interest rate hikes in 2022. So we have modest growth in 22 of 1% and 1.1% for personal income. But that's coming off of right, large increases this year. So if you look at just real U.S. GDP growth and unemployment rate, you see the dramatic decline that occurred, and you also then see the recovery. This chart shows both U.S. GDP and the unemployment rates. So both of them, the unemployment rate dropped dramatically, but then you can see it just as dramatically is recovering, and GDP growth, again, is surpassing where it was pre-pandemic. CPI, also we're seeing the highest levels of inflation, again, in 30 years. We expect that to wane off as we get into 23, and that is largely the result of the end of the spending, the stimulus spending, the recovery spending from the federal government. The percent change in employment, we had seen very significant decreases in employment in New York State. New York State suffered more than the rest of the country, largely because of it started here, and then also the result of the density of the cities. And cities across the nation saw similar impacts of COVID. We are now recovering in jobs, but New York is lagging the rest of the country, and it's actually two parts to it, New York City versus compared to the rest of the state. If you look at the rest of the state outside New York City, the job recovery is tracking more closely to the rest of the nation, while New York City's employment recovery is lagging. And it's lagging mostly in the lower wage sectors, service industry, travel, and tourism. So if you look at employment related to 2019, right, we'll see 20, 21, and 22 are plotted on this table. You can see the recovery in jobs in 22, right, in most industries. But if you look at leisure, hospitality, and other services, which are almost on the bottom of this table, you'll see they were impacted the most, nearly 30% job losses, and they are recovering the slowest. So the impact, and that sector is important to across the state, but in the downstate region particularly, so we're watching those. This is in contrast to the wage growth we're seeing, and that's largely because the wage growth is directly related to the financial sector and parts of the economy that did not, while people were impacted in their offices, they were able to work from home. Sectors where you had to show up and face-to-face, those areas suffered the most. So here's the unemployment rates plotted again, and you can see it peaked, New York State and U.S. Both New York State and the U.S. are seeing sharp declines in unemployment, which are starting to decline at a slower rate. And again, the New York's blue line here is still higher than the rest of the nation, but that is largely because of the anchor of New York City right now in terms of unemployment, not in terms of wages. So New York State income and the employment outlook here, again, we are showing a recovery, both in employment, personal income, and wages, returning to more of a normal period of growth as it was in the pre-pandemic period. And again, there are risks associated with these forecasts. But as you can see, most of the other sectors, we're projecting growth in almost every sector actually, even travel and tourism, but we're seeing a lot of growth in the finance and insurance industry. New York's was more dependent on finance and insurance industry sectors or fire sectors over the last 10 years. Our revenues have diversified significantly, so we're not as dependent on that sector. However, the financial sector is driving a lot of the growth. So we go to the 2023 financial plan overall. So in the mid-year financial plan update, the governor set aside 15%, or started to set aside 15% of spending in reserves. The idea was the recovery is uncertain, how we're recovering from the pandemic is uncertain, and the level of revenue growth is unprecedented, and the state's reserves were lacking. So the intent in the financial plan was to begin saving money and putting money into reserves so we're better prepared for future risks. You all recall when the pandemic hit, we did not have enough reserves, obviously, to make it through the pandemic. So if it wasn't for the federal funds, we would have had to do reductions of up to 20% last year. I think the executive budget last year showed reductions of up to 20%. Once we got the federal funds, we were able to remove those cuts. If we had reserves, then we would be able to have done the same thing in the absence of federal funds. As a result of the revenue increases, we are putting 15% in reserves, and we're able to eliminate our out-year gaps. So in the mid-year, and again, in this executive budget, this will be the first time that the Division of Budget has published a financial plan in New York State with 0 out-year gaps. So there'll be no out-year gaps in the plan period. We are also adding 26 and 27 to the financial plan to also show that there are no gaps as far out as 2027. And that's just to demonstrate that as the federal funds fall off, we still have no out-year gaps, even without the federal funds. And we spread out the federal funds over multiple years to avoid a fiscal cliff. Since the time of the mid-year, we've had more forecast revisions, and again, revenues have climbed even further. So tax receipts are expected to close in the current year about close to $4.9 billion above even the mid-year forecast. So the mid-year assumed planned deposits into reserves. Now the receipts forecast is about $4.9 billion higher than that. So I'll go through how we spend that additional $4.9 billion. Also, spending has decreased, and the spending in school aid claims as a result of schools not being open all the time, so some of the expense-based claims have been reduced. The stock market has contributed to the pension spending for the state going down and local governments. Debt service, we've seen better rates. So, and we've used some of the coronavirus relief funds to offset states' payroll expenses. So one of the eligible uses of the coronavirus relief funds is police and other payroll expenses. So we use that. The CRF funds had to be committed by December 31st of 21. So we fully committed the $5.1 billion in the CRF. So baseline projections, again, are showing surpluses of $5 billion in the current year, 6.4 in 23, 5.3 in 24, and 5.5 in 25. And then we'll show in this plan what we do with those surpluses. And again, that is after we make the deposits to the reserve funds to get to the 15% state operating funds reserve target by 2025. So the surplus position in combination with the reserve deposits already planned makes it possible in this year's budget to really fund new commitments, make investments, right, to address some of the unique problems associated with the recovery from the pandemic or exacerbated by COVID-19, and at the same time, doing it responsibly. Again, we'll make those investments, which we'll talk about, while making deposits in the reserve funds to get to 15% and having 0 out-year gaps, which again, we've never had before. Overall, the executive budget on an all funds basis will be $216 billion. And if you can see where it goes, about 60% of it goes to healthcare, education. This is on an all funds basis, and the reason that healthcare is higher than education on all funds basis is because the federal funds related to Medicaid, and education does not have that level of federal funds. When you look at state operating funds, which is taxpayer dollars and other special revenue funds, then you'll see Medicaid at about 25%, school aid at about 26%, so almost even between the two. And again, that's half of the budget. So half of our state operating funds budget is Medicaid and education. When you look at the all funds includes federal funds and includes capital, which is not in the state funds, state operating funds numbers. So the all funds for 22, we project it's going to close this year at about $212.9 billion. And then the growth rate in the governor's executive budget to last year on an all-funds basis will be about 1.6%. The reason it's low is because a lot of the federal funds fall off, because again, on an all-funds basis, you're counting federal funds. So the federal funds fall off, and that shows 1.6% increase. On a state operating funds basis, we're looking at a $3.6 billion increase, $118.8 billion. And again, that's a 3.1% increase, which is below the projected rate of inflation for 23. That's driven by what's driving the increases: school aid, 7.1% increase in school aid, or $2.1 billion. And that is the second year of a commitment to fully fund foundation aid. Last year, the investment was close to $3 billion. This year, it's 2.1. Foundation aid portion of that is about 1.4. And this is purely formula driven. So we're taking the foundation aid formula, we're fully funding it, which was the commitment, and that has school aid growing at 7.1%. On the Medicaid side, there's a lot of investments that we're making in the Medicaid space and in the healthcare space overall, and that's largely trying to deal with the impacts on the healthcare industry as a result of COVID-19, and hospitals, nursing home care, and the workers have all been impacted dramatically. And the governor's very focused on making sure that that healthcare system not only recovers, but we're prepared for the next pandemic, because obviously there was not lack of preparation, although probably no one was, but lessons learned here, where we're going to make the investment now for the future. Agency operations growing by 1.2%. We do make targeted investments in both personnel and also wage investments in the current workforce. The decline is largely a result of a decline in workforce that you're seeing everywhere. The state is not immune to that. So overall, the financial plan overview, right? The executive budget provides for balanced operations in every year through 2027. So there are no gaps through the entire plan period, and we add an extra year just to demonstrate that there isn't a fiscal cliff associated with the fall off of the federal funds. Spending growth is 3.1% in 23, which is below the rate of inflation, which I believe is about 3.3. The out year growth is driven by school aid and Medicaid, and at the same time, all of these commitments are sustainable over the plan period, and with the current year surplus of $5 billion, largely used to fund one-time expenses. So we did not want to ramp up spending based on surpluses that then recur, and then you're not able to make those investments later. So where does the surplus go? We make, in this budget, there are about $7 billion in proposed actions that are not permanent spending, so they're one-time costs. They don't contribute to out-year gaps, but they're critically important. $2.2 billion for property tax relief. That's taking some of the surplus, giving it back to 2 million New Yorkers. This $2 billion will be set aside for pandemic recovery initiatives. The goal of that is to work with the legislature and identify what are the most targeted investments that we need to make, but we set that aside for one-time pandemic recovery initiatives. $1 billion goes to the new 5-year capital plan. So we have a 5-year capital plan for highways and bridges. It's across the state. It's $32.8 billion, and we put some hard dollar funding in there, which the governor mentioned in her speech this morning. $1 billion for healthcare transformation. We're also setting aside $1 billion in a reserve for transformation for the healthcare industry. Again, we're learning lessons every day in the healthcare side, and we wanted to set that money aside, so also to work with the legislature and identify the priorities for healthcare and transformation. $1 billion goes for bonuses for healthcare and frontline workers. That number is actually larger, closer to $2 or $3 billion when we add in federal support for those numbers. So there is some match and some federal resources that we have identified as well that will also go to bonuses for direct care, frontline healthcare workers who are still dealing with the pandemic as we speak across the state. And then $350 million is for pandemic relief for businesses, and some of the travel, some of the Broadway, music industry, those kinds of parts of the sector that have been impacted most severely. They were starting to recover before Omicron, and then as you have all seen, a lot of these performance venues had to shut down again, and those venues are critical for the economy, particularly in the downstate region. So while we're making, again, all of these investments, at the same time, we're still making the deposits to reserves, and we still have a balanced plan. The spending growth, we talked about this. This is where it's going. You see school aid is at 7.1. The number for Medicaid, that is just the Medicaid cap number of 4.7%, because we increased the global cap to 4.7. Actual spending in Medicaid, all in, is actually over 6%. So school aid is 7.1% as a result of the funding the foundation aid. And Medicaid is actually over 6%, which is not reflected here. And you can see overall we're at 3.1 and inflation is 3.2. The financial plan overview, this is the base budget surplus. So these are the revisions to the financial plan, which show $6.4 billion increase in 23, followed by 5.3 in 24, followed by 5. So these are the receipt forecasts that we're seeing this year, how it follows through to each one of those years. So this enables us to both make the investments while also making the deposits to the reserve funds. So then we talked about these, but we have the homeowner tax rebate credit, middle class tax cut acceleration. There was a middle class tax cut that was supposed to be phased in. We're accelerating that to 23 so that people can just get that faster. The small business tax relief, there's the healthcare frontline worker bonuses, which we discussed. There's a COLA of 5.4% for all the human services agencies. Higher education, which fund new operating aid for both SUNY and CUNY, and then mental hygiene. And then there's other, again, PAYGO capital and other items. But as you can see, the important line here is you start off with those surplus numbers on top, and we end up with zeros on the bottom, and that's fully funding all of the spending through the years and the gaps. This is the out-year gaps. This is the history. We can take that first bar and go back as long as you want. There are always gaps. This is a roll-up of the 3-year gaps. So after when we present every executive budget, we also present the gaps for the next 3 years. So those are the 3 colors that you're seeing there, right? So those are the following 3-year gaps. So if you look at 2010, during the executive budget in 2010, there were out-year gaps of $24.7 billion over the next 3 years. And then those are the gaps from 2010, again, through 21, as you can see. In 22, after we got the federal money, it was $3.4 billion. And then from 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27, we have 0 out-year gaps. Federal relief. We took the federal relief, and it's a direct financial plan benefit for us. It came in 3 forms. This FEMA aid is just still coming in. And we've spent all of the CRF. Again, that's the yellow here. And that had to be spent by December 31st of the current year. We received $12.75 billion in 21, and we're using that over 4 years. Again, we have resources to make investments, and we spread it out over 4 years to avoid a fiscal cliff and to make sure that what we're seeing on the revenue side holds up over that plan period, and we're doing it. But we're not sacrificing investments, and I think you can see that in all of the spending that is in this budget. The remainder of the 5.1 fund had to be spent by December 31st, and then we use 2023. We have $2 billion reserve in 23, 2.25 in 24, and then 3.6 in 25. And again, we go out in our financial plan to 26 and 27 to just show that even when those fall off, we still have a balanced plan. $12.75 billion was the amount in revenue shortfall that we received from the American Rescue Plan. We've calculated a revenue loss for the period of $9.9 billion. We're waiting for the federal government to approve that calculation and methodology. In the event that that's not approved, we'll find other places to spend that money. But the aid can be used to support pandemic response efforts, lost state revenue, which was our main issue at the time, aid households, small businesses, industries, essential workers, and communities disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, water and sewer, and broadband, all of the things that we are doing in this budget. So we are funding in every single one of those areas. And this money is in hand, but it's not guaranteed yet until the feds approve our calculation. So the fiscal crisis and reserves, right? Since 2000, state finances have been badly damaged 3 times by sudden events. We've had 9/11, we've had the Great Recession, we've had COVID, and none of these events were predictable. And what we know for sure, right, is they will happen again. Something will happen, it has. And every time there's been shocks to the system, and every time from a budgetary perspective, from the state's perspective, our ability to respond is directly related to what funding that we have. Each time the state has found itself unprepared, inadequate reserves, and the outcome was that we had to cut or go back on promises or commitments that were made, and they've been deferred. The best or real-world example was in 2008. There was a state commitment to fund foundation aid for school aid. We had no money set aside during that time. We hit a recession, and that commitment lasted just 2 years. And then starting in FY10, the state had the recession, and then we had to not only freeze foundation, but we had to make reductions in school aid. We did not come back to that level of school aid spending, or we could not fully fund foundation aid again until 2022. So it took from 2008 to 2022 before we recovered. The point here is that if we're going to make these investments, make them with allocating reserves so that in the event that you have some of these shocks to the system, we won't have a repeat performance in the same crisis. The state will be prepared. Reserves are the best defense for repeat performance. At Governor Hochul's direction, in the mid-year budget, we started the plan to put reserves aside by 15%, and this budget fulfills that commitment with a reserves deposit of close to $5 billion in the current year and each year until we hit 15% of state operations spending. And again, there are no gaps in the out year when we're doing that. Experts across from the Government Financial Officers Association, Center for Budget Policy Priorities, all recommend for any size of government having 15% in reserve in order to avoid cuts, right, at a time of an economic downturn. The federal government doesn't have to keep money in reserve because it's an economic downturn. They print money. We can't, and the state is forced to. The executive budget must be presented as a balanced budget each year, so we cannot deficit spend. So either we make reductions, you have 2 options, raise taxes, or make reductions in spending when there's a downturn. This is a hypothetical recession scenario. So just an order of magnitude, we took the previous recessions and did a simulation of what would happen in New York State. And the range in the past 3 recessions, the range of revenue loss is between 36 to 50 billion over the 3-year period. So the size of the losses just illustrate the challenge, right, of setting aside significant reserves to weather a downturn. So even with the level of 15% reserves, right, you can pay for about half of these scenario revenue losses. Now, perhaps they won't be that dramatic next time, and perhaps they will, but there'll be other funds available, but this insulates us from that, and those are real world. We've seen it before. So these are the deposits to the principal reserves that we've been talking about. In the current year, $5 billion in the reserves as a deposit. And again, that is, and then we do spend another $5 billion in surplus. So the $5 billion in surplus is on top of the $5 billion that we're putting away in the plan deposits. So this allows us to do both. Make the investments while also planning for the future. And also remember, this money is not in the bank. We do not have all of the funds for these deposits today. We have the funds for the deposit in 22 today. We believe in 23. That deposit also is in our plan. And the 24 and 25 deposits are assuming that our revenue, that we have no more shocks, which we talked about, happen periodically, and no one knows when they are, and that the revenues continue at the current, not the current rate of growth, but continue without reversing. So by 2025, we get to the 15%. What are the risks to the plan? We have sudden catastrophic events that we've seen. Again, 9/11, Great Recession, COVID-19, you name it, Superstorm Sandy, right? And then there are other trends that we are watching that could erode the state's wealth over time. We have slow population growth, which the governor has talked about previously, tax migration. So if there are people who are moving to other parts of the state over the parts of the country. And then we have telework, which is a new trend that was accelerated as a result of COVID. And depending on where they go, right, our ability, both the state's and New York's ability, right, to tax individuals who are working for New York companies but are located in other parts of the state for long periods of time, may be challenged. Short memories and optimism is just, we forget sometimes some of the down cycles and what we had to do, and over-optimism, if that's a word, but people being too optimistic about what is going to happen in the future. And you spend to that point, and again, you end up going backwards, right? And I think it's more important to have certainty. So overall, this budget invests smartly. We prepare for the future. We're mitigating risks that we're seeing, and we're building reserves at a level that has not been seen before. So thank you.